and welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I am your host, Beth Bailey, and I'm here today with Shannon Galpin, who has just an incredible story of supporting Afghan women in particular. And just, Shannon, you've done so many things to help humans, and I'm really excited to have you here. I'm going to read you guys Shannon's bio, as I always do on the intro. Shannon Galpin is a social justice activist, author, artist, and filmmaker. She's spent 2 decades working with Afghans, and during the 8 years she worked in Afghanistan, she worked in women's prisons with the deaf community, created women's education programs, supported the first graffiti artists workshops and music festivals, and spent years supporting the first women's cycling teams. Shannon is a fellow with the Royal Geographical Society and a National Geographic Adventurer of the Year. In 2009, Shannon became the first person to mountain bike in Afghanistan. She continued to travel through Afghanistan by bike for several years, using the bike as a tool to explore and interrogate gender barriers. She supported and trained the first Afghan women's national cycling team and helped build and support the Right to Ride movement across Afghanistan. When the Taliban returned, Shannon evacuated athletes and human rights defenders, set up safe houses, and resettled hundreds of Afghans into dozens of countries. Shannon is the author of 2 books on Afghanistan, including her memoir, Mountain to Mountain and Streets of Afghanistan. Currently, Shannon is building the first Afghan women's sports archive to ensure that their legacy is preserved for present and future generations, which I think is so important because women can't do sporting in Afghanistan anymore under the Taliban, along with most things. So, Shannon, it's a pleasure to have you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to centering these stories.
Absolutely. Yeah, somebody has to because they're actively being silenced.
Absolutely.
So I want to start by talking about your work in Afghanistan. You know, that's something that personally I have not been able to do. And so I'm enamored of all of the things that you were able to do inside of Afghanistan. What was that like? When did you get there? What was your initial purpose? Let's start there.
Okay. And sorry for if you can hear the buzzing now. It starts
I thought it
right
was
on
my
cue.
end.
No, I apologize.
No, it's
I have
great.
horrifying neighbors. So I started working in Afghanistan. I started working for Afghanistan in 2006, which is when I established a nonprofit, Mountain to Mountain. But I started traveling to Afghanistan in 2008. And I've made over 25 visits to Afghanistan, each about a month. And I would go back and forth from my home in Colorado, where I was a single parent, or co-parent, I should say, to be fair. I went to Afghanistan originally with the idea that I wanted to interrogate 2 things. One, I wanted to understand kind of the truth behind the headlines. I wanted to understand what was the relationship in Afghanistan as an American woman, and what the reality was for Afghan women beyond the headlines, and have a real interaction, and spent a month just listening and meeting with women all over the country. I had an incredible translator and fixer who essentially kind of peeled back, the veil behind Afghanistan. I met with women who were teachers, who were parliamentary members, who were students, young, old, women who were in relatively privileged positions, and women in prison. So kind of really the whole gamut, and from all sorts of different ethnicities, so that I wasn't only meeting with one group and having a very narrow entry point. And so that really helped to open my eyes to a variety of perspectives. And I did not go in thinking that, okay, I'm going to go in and I'm going to set up these projects with very little understanding. But it opened up the possibility of working in Afghanistan. I came back and started developing the first projects, which evolved into working with the deaf community, working in the women's prisons, and setting up computer labs in girls' schools.
That's incredible. I want to ask, just as a side question, why were these women in prisons? Because now, obviously, women are being stoned for instance, having an extramarital affair, when their extramarital affair partner is not being stoned for this, so the punishment system has changed. But what were these women under the former Afghan government in prison for?
A lot of it was similar. It was there was the holdovers that had not changed. It wasn't they didn't have the violence. I mean, the physically violent punishments that had existed under the former Taliban regime, but the conservative nature in many provinces still existed in terms of morality laws that had not yet changed. And so women were in prison for trying to escape arranged marriages. They were in prison for the crime of being raped. They were in prison for any number of, quote unquote, morality crimes. Some that I met were in prison for having helped others escape arranged marriages. And then I met women who, quite, confidently, boldly admitted, I killed my husband. But the reasons in which they killed their husband are reasons in which, they were, we may call that self-defense. We may call that, defending their children. We may call that, there are extenuating circumstances often. And in most cases, none of them had been allowed to defend themselves. In the court of law at the time, a woman's voice was worth 2/3 of a man's voice. So you had the situation in which, one, many of them didn't have a lawyer or someone to defend them in a court of law, but also, unless there was someone willing to stand up for them, their voice wasn't even equal to a man's voice in terms of what that was weighted. So I visited multiple prisons across the country, women's prisons across the country. They were of varying degrees of hygiene and safety. There were babies being born in prison, and so that means that they were being taken advantage of or raped in prison by guards. And that, the conditions evolved over the 2 decades, and became safer and safer.
I'm glad to hear that it got safer, but yeah, I'm not, it's just, the situation for Afghan women has just never been fantastic.
No.
And it must have been hard to see that every day, when you're going into those situations. What other so you also were working with the deaf community. What was that like? And was there as robust a system of supporting the deaf community in Afghanistan as there is, say, in the US?
No, absolutely not. The deaf community was incredible. I learned so much working with the deaf community. I'm so grateful, again, to my fixer, Najibullah Siddiqui, who had introduced me to the deaf community in Kabul, who were building their own language. So they were building their own Afghan, their own Dari sign language, so that they had their own language, versus just adopting the British Sign Language or American Sign Language. They were building their own language, so that they had their own connection to language, which is a huge undertaking. The first step was they had been renting space for a school. They were doing outreach into the communities. But the deaf, more than any other disability, was severely misunderstood. They were often just considered dumb or mute, and then kind of shunned off to the side. And we had orchestrated a meeting with President Karzai at the time to try to get a land donation to build a school. And I mean, he was quite well known for this, but then he cried when he discovered that there were deaf people living within Afghanistan. And I was just like, how, you're an educated man. You know that deaf people exist everywhere around the world. Like, this can't be a shock, especially in a country that has so much cause for becoming deaf from just the physical explosions. It's not just, being born deaf. You also just become deaf because there's so many violent explosions and other things that happen. But regardless, even though inside, you're groaning with the theatrics of it all, He did give us a land donation, and that land donation allowed for the future construction of the school, without which there never would have been a home built, in terms of the ability to have safety and development of schools.
Wow. I just can't even imagine somebody thinking that there is no deaf, there can't be a deaf community here. Like,
Yeah, right. Yeah, we don't have blind or deaf or
no,
disabled, or we don't have women.
not
Like, I mean,
here.
it's the simplicity of that argument, that from the leader of a country who was educated in the West. I mean, all of the things that come into that, where you're like, yeah, the
No, that's
theatrics
crazy.
continue to boggle one's mind often.
Oh yeah, and you see it. It's interesting to hear the other side. I've seen it with the Taliban, but
Yeah,
to hear it,
which
it's
yeah,
okay. This is
yeah, it's
honestly,
I don't know
it,
who anyone ever thinks is buying the arguments, of like, or the stagecraft and theatrics, but somehow they think that. I mean,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that's very true. They do think they're pulling one over and
mhm.
never.
Every
Um,
country.
let's talk about when you started. When did you decide I'm going to mountain bike here? This is a great place to do this. Like, how far into
Yeah,
being in Afghanistan were you?
yeah, that always is the one that kind of throws people for a loop. I didn't ever go to Afghanistan thinking, oh, I'm going to mountain bike in Afghanistan, particularly back in like 2007, 2008. But on my very first visit in 2008, I was a mountain biker. I am a mountain biker. And I was struck by the fact that I saw, as you do across Afghanistan, whether it's urban in Kabul or rural communities, everyone is on bikes. Kind of whether it's the crush of traffic within Kabul or whether it's in rural communities, bikes are a very popular mode of transportation. But it was always men and boys. I didn't see a single woman on bikes, and I was struck by that. And it was to be expected had it been Taliban times. It was to be expected under a circumstance even if I had maybe been in Kandahar, where I knew things were still tightly controlled. Most women still were in burqas. But we were in Kabul and then in Panjshir and other provinces. And as I continued to ask questions and interrogate, the idea of women riding bikes, it was clear that it was still the last held taboo. And it was considered obscene for women to ride a bike, to ride a motorcycle. Occasionally I would see women on a motorcycle or on a bicycle, but they would be side saddle on the back. Still like somehow like Velcroed onto the back and holding on.
Sounds very
I,
safe.
yeah, I don't know how, they managed to stick. But it is really important to understand that this is a time in which women were becoming they were half the parliament. They were becoming doctors. They were becoming judges. They were, flooding the schools and the universities. Women were marching in the streets as activists for the first time in a long time, since pre-Taliban times. Women's sports were beginning to take off in numerous ways. Football, boxing, basketball, all of these different sports were becoming very popular. But cycling, which is a mode of transportation, was just still highly, highly taboo. And it was considered obscene. And it was really linked back to, very much as I continued to explore this taboo, very much linked back to our own American, British, French suffragette movements of obscenity. Women who ride bikes are considered immoral, bad women, women who ride bikes are, literally, yeah, we're considered obscene, bad, immoral women. And that is no different. It's just a century later. It's not a Muslim, Christian, thing. It's not an American versus Afghan thing. It is women on bikes. They're going to get into trouble. They're obscene. And it can take your virginity. That's the other thing. Linked through history is the idea that bikes can take your virginity. Yeah, right? I mean, literally.
Fertility. Really need to take a deep breath.
Absolutely.
I mean, geez, doing things like dance can, anyway, we don't need to get into
you could fall down the stairs.
Right.
Yeah.
And get beaten by someone, which happens all the time to Afghan women. And
absolutely.
Anyway.
And so the bike really is this, it's so interesting because the bike historically is a revolutionary vehicle. It is the most revolutionary vehicle potentially ever invented. And that is why, historically, when women ride bikes, they are looked upon as rebels, as obscene. It's why it's linked to the suffragette movements around the world. And why Afghan women, why Saudi women, why others have been kept off of them for so long. So myself, what I discovered on my first visit was that I was given a lot of leeway. Every white presenting foreigner will tell you the same story of, being treated as an equal by Afghan men and Afghan society. And I just, every chance I got, used it to my advantage to infiltrate and investigate those gender barriers so that I could better understand what those prejudices and taboos were. Why was I allowed to be in these spaces with men? And why was I sitting at the table with men when Afghan women weren't? So that we could eventually have those conversations and bring my Afghan sisters into those spaces. And when I realized that I would not be, typically what I realized was that I would not be punished for doing things, riding motorcycles, riding Buzkashi horses, and then eventually riding bikes, then I did those in ways in which to normalize that a woman could do them in hopes that you also would see Afghan women doing them. And so the mountain bike became one of those things.
That's amazing. And it worked in that case, which, when you say that, I immediately think about the post-withdrawal time and, some countries sending their women to go speak with Taliban delegations. And that didn't make a difference with the Taliban at all. But obviously, you're able to break this barrier under the prior government, which...
And I would say that, when I speak to people, like Fazia Kufi, Fazia Kufi speaking with the Taliban, she has incredible stories of how perceptions of over the timeline of speaking with the Taliban, how the perception and the tension speaking with the Taliban changed during their negotiations, just of how they treated the female delegation, as women, that perception changed. And I think that is what's very interesting, is it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, just like the cycling revolution didn't happen overnight.
That's absolutely amazing. Let's talk about what it took, how many women were interested at first, how did it grow, and what timeline did that follow?
So I think what's very important is that to understand is I began cycling in 2009, and I began mountain biking in the Panjshir province and in Kabul, in the mountains of Kabul. And then that expanded into other areas across the northern provinces and in Bamiyan, always just trying to ride for, a couple of days while I was there working in the provinces where I was. I would just bring a bike and I would always just test out and talk with the locals as to what their reactions were. And always asking the question, would you let your sister, daughter, wife, mother ride? Also did your grandmother or mother ride bikes? Like, is there anyone in your family? Trying to find out through oral history if anyone had ridden. That continued for several years. And it was a complete accident that I found out, not a complete accident. I mean, it was becoming known that I rode a bike and that I was doing these things as I was doing my other projects. And I found out that there was a men's cycling team in Kabul. So under the Olympic Federation, a men's team had been founded. I was invited to go meet and go for a ride with the men's team. And when I went to this little gas station, this little petrol station on the northern side of Kabul, and we were going to ride out on the highway, the coach showed up before we took off on our ride, and with him was a woman. And it was like she was kind of acting like his assistant. And it turned out she was the captain of the women's team. So very quietly, a year prior, a women's team was formed. The coach basically had started teaching his daughter to ride and formed a women's team, and recognizing that there was very little funding for men. Like, cycling means nothing as a sport in Afghanistan. There was no money from the Olympic Federation. There's no money within Afghanistan for cycling. But the international community would fund women's programs. So he realized that if he had a women's team, that he could probably get more support. Very clever. And so it turned out that this woman was Marjan Siddiqui. She was the captain of the team. And as soon as I found out, that was it. I mean, this is the fall of 2012, 4 years after almost 4 years to the day that I had first started mountain biking. And that was it. From that moment on, in 2012, everything I did in Afghanistan was around cycling. I immediately started fundraising. We did gear drives. We got sponsorships for brand new racing bikes and supporting the national team. But also, almost like popcorn, there were bike clubs that started independently sprouting up. They had no idea there was a national team. They were just girls starting to teach other girls to ride. And then in Bamiyan, an independent girls team was emerging, again, completely separate from the national team. And it is the only women's-founded, women's-led bike team in the history of Afghanistan. No men were involved other than supporting them and helping them, but they did it themselves. And so I supported them and helped them, rode with them, mentored, donated bikes. But these women, they did it themselves. You know, they did this. And so really what I think is amazing is they had one decade, basically about 2011 was these little nascent seeds that were being planted. And then 2021, it all ended. But so there was a decade of a cycling revolution. And at the end, in 2021, there were registered cyclists with the Federation, the Olympic Federation, in 7 provinces, over 200 women registered as like official cyclists, whatever that means. But there were mountain bikers, road cyclists, BMX riders, all that were registered cyclists. And then you had the independent team in Bamiyan that had grown to multiple teams, several dozen riders. You had stage racing in Afghanistan, the first women's-led racing in the history of the country. And you had bike clubs, independent bike clubs that were founded by women for women to just teach each other how to ride, and co-ed bike clubs of men and girls. Men and boys and girls, men and women riding together.
That's really interesting to hear. Were those mostly like in Kabul, or were they in the provinces too?
They were in the provinces too.
Wow,
yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Because that is still like a bit of a taboo to break.
Absolutely. But no, it was also in the provinces, and there was racing across multiple provinces, like up in the north in Fairab, in Herat, Khost, Balkh province had racing, Panjshir. Yeah, it was, but the heart of it was Bamiyan. Bamiyan was the heart, and then Kabul. Those are the two centers.
Very cool. Very cool. And so they got that decade of revolution time. And when did you get the sense? I guess when was your last trip to Afghanistan before the fall?
My last trip was 2017.
Okay. What was your feeling as the withdrawal approached? And, I mean, did you think that the government was going to hold out? Did you see what was coming, and how did you react? Because obviously you played a huge role in saving some lives. So I feel like you must have had some lead up time or some people reaching out to you with concern. What was that like?
So in the extreme lead up, like in the spring, myself and other human rights defenders were speaking out publicly, kind of wherever we could get a mouthpiece, and setting up panels and speaking out, saying, because we felt like no one was actually centering women's rights. There was just a complete dismissal, particularly by men in media, men who were, foreign policy advisors. Everybody was dismissing the issue of women's rights. And lots of talk about the Taliban 2.0. And we were just like, we're so tired of hearing this. You have no idea. It was really disgusting. It was really disgusting. It was a complete dismissal. And that was just largely pushed aside. Everybody was just largely very dismissive. I then, in June, moved to Scotland with my daughter. She was 16. We moved to Scotland. She's dual citizen. Her father was English. So long story short, we moved to Scotland. So we were in the process of just getting settled in a new country and I was completely tuned out and focused on just getting my daughter settled in a new country. And then her father died. He fell off a mountain. And I was not looking at it at all. 3 days before the Taliban walked into Kabul is when I started paying attention. So I had no prior awareness. I just wasn't paying attention. So August 12th is my first communication with anyone. When I've looked back into my WhatsApp messaging, August 12th is when I started reaching out to everybody, going, are you okay? Where are you? What do we need to be doing? Do you have any, starting building a list, starting to, as everybody I'm sure has already said, thinking that we had an evacuation process. So gathering contact information lists, submitting them to so-called State Department lists, hoping they'd be on evacuation flights, gathering all of that. And then that became a year-long 24/7 blur of building this digital constellation that, I would say it was basically for the first probably 6 months that was just, you didn't sleep. And I think a lot of people that I've talked to, you say that and you think that sounds ridiculous, but really people didn't. I know people who were like, our eyeballs were bleeding. It was insane. But those are the people who also got people out. We're the people who say that, who actually still had connections to Afghanistan. And so we weren't relying on airplanes. We immediately were pivoting to other ways of getting people out. And I remember, the insanity of it, I remember being on, someone had dumped me onto a Signal chat with, I'm sure there was military veterans and other, high-level State Department officials and things, people that I did not know, but there were calls about this. And I remember saying, kind of being that person who's like, sorry if this is a stupid question, as women tend to do, which, we shouldn't. But I'm like, why aren't we using other airports? I don't understand why everything's funneling into Kabul. And maybe that is stupid. Like that, absolutely, that could be a stupid question. But these are civilian airports. These are not military airports. Why is everything going to Kabul? And literally, someone with the State Department said, I didn't know there was more than one airport in Afghanistan.
Oh God.
Now, obviously, military people will know that. There's lots of other people who were advising that did know that. But literally, he said, I didn't know there was more than one airport in Kabul. And to be fair, that could handle aircraft. I'm like, there's like 5. And I rattled them all off. And then I said, and also, you're trying to move most of your people from Bamyan. Bamyan can take aircraft. He goes, oh, I thought they could only take helicopters. I'm like, it can take aircraft. I've flown into it. I have literally flown in and out of it. It can take aircraft. And so it was those sort of things a month in that, they hadn't moved to Balkh yet. They hadn't moved to Mazar-e-Sharif yet. Anyways, it was that sort of insanity that you just realize how inept people who actually make salary are. And I'm like, I'm just sitting cross-legged in an empty apartment right now, moving people across a border that you're telling me is closed. And I was getting passports produced in another country and reverse smuggled into Afghanistan. And you're telling me you can't do anything. I'm nobody. I'm literally nobody with no connections. But you are in a position of power and privilege, and you're not even willing to help me.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a familiar song and dance, right?
Yeah.
But like, I think you are the first person who has said on this podcast that they were pushing people across the Pak border, which is a perfectly
okay. I'll tell you everything.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, and I know other people who did that on their own,
Yeah.
like Afghans who did it on their own through like
yeah,
family
no.
rat lines, right? But like, yeah, I mean, it's
No,
not
it's
just
absolutely.
Twerkum and shaman and stuff. Like you can push through in different ways. So you knew those
Absolutely.
ways because of your work or because of your mountain biking or
both. And because Afghans, because I have we talk to Afghans, like we know what they know the smuggle, they know their old, call them smuggling routes, but like how they have moved across these borders, whether it's into Iran or into Pakistan. We knew we didn't want them going into Iran if they could help it because we wouldn't be able to help them.
Yeah.
And so, whereas for some of them, their family connections of historically moving to Iran and coming back again versus going to Pakistan and coming back again over previous evacuations, their own self-evacuations over the past immigration. I just was like, if you go to Iran, then I'm so stuck. I don't have as an American, I don't have those resources. Other countries might be able to help you. And my main ties were through Britain or through the US in terms of support. I was then looking at over a dozen countries to relocate people to. I only relocated a few people into the US because I just knew that, one, it was going to be very difficult because of how many SIV applications there were going to be, and that was not a route I was chasing. And also, if we're very honest, the support for refugees in the US is awful. It is diabolical. And so the support for refugees in other countries, I wanted to give them the best possible lives. These are people that I knew and cared about. So I would prefer for them to get support in a country that actually provides housing, language, jobs, education, and that they have, a better chance at rebuilding their lives. And we don't do that in the US. And that is something that we should work towards as a country in the future.
Yeah, it's a great big debate. I think that right before your episode comes out, one with Danilo Zach at the Church World Service talking about, their resettlement aid. And especially when all of this started, resettlement groups were just getting past all of the, the push down that they faced under the first Trump administration, from my understanding. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's been hard, but I will say, I've got so many contacts with these amazing resettlement agencies that grew up just to support Afghans because of
Yeah.
the influx of Afghans, and they have worked so hard to make up for that
Oh,
shortcoming and to like
absolutely.
create this community and do these beautiful things, but it wasn't ready at the time. And
Yes.
I'm not surprised that you found other places that were willing. I mean, I have just talked about this on the podcast and many times before, but like the US RAP, right? The US Refugee Admissions Program, I can't I remember when Afghans in that program started telling me, "Oh, they're not sending me to the US. I'm going to Canada." And I'm like, "Wait, what? It's the US Refugee Admission Program. Why are you going to Canada? Like, why are other countries taking on our refugees?" But it's good to hear that maybe that was a good thing for some people if they did get better resettlement assistance
Yeah.
and
Oh,
had more,
absolutely. Canada had a pretty, I sent a group, or I shouldn't say sent. I was lucky that Canada
yeah.
accepted a large group because they had really opened a large group specifically for women. And so we qualified for the women athletes. Um, and they took a group of women. And, while it's really hard because one of the failings in Canada that the US is better at, because there's gives and takes with all of these programs. One of the things that Canada isn't great with is that they aren't very strong with their family reunification. And the US, particularly if we had any people that were minors, we were able to reunify two families. But the Canadians, we weren't able to do that with any of this group of single young women who were all part of a cycling team. We were able to get them there, but we couldn't reunify the families. But they were all given housing. They were all given financial support for I think, I can't remember how long, but I think it's a year. They were given a stipend. They all get English lessons for, I think, 2 years. And Canada can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But it's, it's,
Canada.
yeah, but
Or
it's
should I say
enough to
Canada?
like,
Bad Bunny lives rent
yeah,
free
but
in my head now.
I know. And watching their reaction, like, we're included in this? Like, we,
I'm in Alberta.
you
Like, oh my
know,
God, I love
we
this.
get to be included. They have given these young women, while it is still incredibly hard to be a young woman and separated from everyone.
Yeah.
It is a chance to have a foundation to then build from. But I think what you've just said in terms of the resettlement groups, I mean, they are an invaluable resource. But they're overstretched, as you said, and they're even more overstretched, obviously now, and given what's happening, and mutual aid and solidarity work is it is invaluable. It is something that we are constantly needing to refuel and rebuild and recognize that that it's community building. It's community building. I'm originally from Minneapolis. I grew up in Bismarck, North Dakota, and we don't like Bismarck, North Dakota. When I grew up and went to high school, there's not a lot of there weren't a lot of refugees. But I found out after I left that there was an incredible refugee community resource that had gone back decades. Like, I had no idea like that had existed, like going back into the 60s, I believe. Like,
Yeah.
that is what we rely on.
But if you don't interact with it, you don't know,
Yeah.
and that's the thing that's
Navigating the system
yeah.
and knowing how to plug everybody together.
Right. And just, I mean, being able to live your life without realizing what's going on in the people around you. We are all able to do that so well. And
Yeah, it's a lot of privilege.
it is a lot of privilege. And I'm much happier now knowing all the things that are going on, but it still is
Yeah.
so much not a part of my daily, regular life, right? I don't, it's in my working. And anyway,
Yeah.
I think about that often. I want to talk about
Yeah.
your work now because obviously it's incredible
Yeah.
that you're able to change these lives and get people to safety, because they wouldn't have been able to, even if they had found a way to live safely under the Taliban, they wouldn't have been able to do things like bike or
Yeah.
any other, I don't know if you saw this, a woman named Sunny, who's like a I want to say bodybuilder might be the best term for her, but she had gone to Afghanistan. And unlike most of the people who've gone to Afghanistan post withdrawal, who kind of like make it sound like it's great, she had shared a lot of videos of the things that she had been able to do that Afghan women could not do. And one of the things she also shared was like an image of her working out in the place where she was living, but she had to do it inside. She couldn't do it outside. That was not acceptable. And she's like, I mean, this woman is ripped, like you would not believe. And and I thought that was so refreshing as a reminder that like if you want to do this as an Afghan, this is how you have to do it. And showing the world, because they can't
And
they can't do any of those things anymore.
no, and I think it's important to remember that even if you do it inside, Afghan women can't do that inside.
Not with their men.
No,
Mm-mm.
Khadija, I'm looking at my notes because I can never remember her last name. Khadija Amazada, who is a Taekwondo athlete, she's 22 from Herat, was
Yep.
arrested. And
Yep.
she
For
was jailed
teaching.
for 12 days, threatened with stoning. But I do believe the only reason that she and her father and the owner of the space were released, because luckily they were released after 12 days, is because there was a mobilization based upon what we see with Iranian athletes who are jailed and threatened with execution, that if there's a public mobilization of outrage and social media, they are typically released or their death sentence is commuted. And she was released. I don't think that that would have happened if there hadn't been a mass mobilization.
Yeah.
And that she was not out in public. It was an underground, and that's the thing is right now in Afghanistan, there is no safety. You can't, under the first Taliban regime, there were women's spaces. The beauty shops were open. Life was horrifyingly bad, but there were underground schools. Women's spaces were kind of left alone, and I don't want to say that lightly because women were persecuted. But now it is a million times worse than it ever was the first time. Women's spaces are closed down in ways they were not in the first one. The fact that women have to wear an eye patch under their burqa, that the sound of their voices is illegal, that you have to have drapes over your windows. These are things in which the U.S., not just the U.S., but the rest of the world is ignoring. And now that we have the Olympics happening, it is appalling that every time we don't have a mega sporting event, we aren't in outrage. It is an outrage that we aren't naming the fact that Afghanistan women are banned from all sports. It's just an outrage.
Yeah. Well, and I think, to go back to like the women even being able to just do it in the privacy of their homes, right? Khadijah, yes, she was doing something outside of it very bravely. And I was very glad when she was released because that was really a terrible and devastating thing. But it also shows how afraid Taliban men are of women who can fight back. Like they are the littlest people in the world. But my point here is they have weaponized men against their women, right? Because it's not, who gets the punishment oftentimes if a woman doesn't do the right thing. It is her husband, it is her father, it is her brother. They are enforcing this by turning the family into the enforcers. And that makes it, they can't do those things because then the social order is getting even more regressive and it's oppressive, and it's difficult to see that and see how no one's doing anything. But then I'm also not surprised because look at the way women are treated in the West. Women have so many things that they're supposed to be, and they are belittled and they're shoved aside all the time. And so of course we're going to forget Afghan women and just say, whatever, we can't do anything about it. I don't know what the justification is, honestly, at this point.
And I think that what I discovered when I first went to Afghanistan was often that it's very easy to point over there and be like, look how oppressed those women are. Look how, particularly the moral crimes and the morality crimes and other things. And yet, what happens when a U.S. woman is raped? She is blamed. What was she drinking?
What was she wearing?
Mm-hmm. Very rarely is the rapist punished. Is there accountability? Often the source of blame is on the woman. And what I found, and that's just one tiny example, what I have found when it comes to things is we are way more similar than we are different. The rights, and so when we look at that, the rights of women are global and they are intertwined. Yep. And, that's why when people have often asked me, well, why do you work over there? Why do you do that? I am not free until all women are free. That is Audre Lorde, and it strikes more and more every day as we see rights being eroded in different ways around the world.
Yep.
And when we look backwards, I have a photo, I think you can see it behind me, of Afghan women learning filmmaking and journalism in the 60s. We look backwards to remember, and that's why, this will tie back to the archive, actually. These things are like a pendulum, and that's why history and education are so important, because Afghan women had more rights in the past than they do now. And that is because of government, and that is because of empire and imperialism and all sorts of different things. But what I found fascinating in learning history was that Afghan women had the right to vote before US women did, before British women did. And their rights were enshrined in their constitution in ways that ours weren't. Now, that can still get taken away, but that also means ours can get taken away. And so no one has their rights enshrined forever. Yeah. And that's the lesson in Afghanistan, is their rights, they already fought for the right to vote, they already achieved them, and they were enshrined in a constitution. Everyone can lose or gain their rights. Nothing is permanent, but they're not oppressed. They are not victims, I guess is the right thing. They're not victims. They are being held under a boot, and the world needs to stand up with them.
Yeah. They don't want to be under the boot. I don't know any women who really want to be in that situation. And we don't even understand a quarter of what's really happening there, because we're not in the houses, and we're not, so yeah, I think it's really important. I think one of my favorite guests has been Heather Barr, because we come from very different political.
She's a dear friend.
Yeah, well, and I am a conservative woman. Like, in my heart of hearts, I think I've become much more independent over the last few years. But and Heather's not, and it was so refreshing to have her, because I think at our core, there's still this really important. She said something that was really important, and it was, any women anywhere who are having their rights taken away, it is a threat, just like you said, to women everywhere. And that's why this is important to all of us. If they can do it there, they can do it here, just like you're saying. And you don't have to have any political leaning to believe that. All you need to understand is just look at it.
This is apolitical.
Yes.
This is about human rights and dignity for everyone.
Yep.
And
it's so, and that's the thing, is it's really easy to pretend. And I think we've gotten into a point of view where we don't see people who are different from us as humans, oftentimes, in the same way that we see ourselves as humans. And that's one thing I try to do through this podcast, is remind people, no, Afghans are just as human as we are.
Here's what I always come back to is they're not a monolith.
That's true too.
Because if you said to someone, this is how I feel about Americans, and meaning the US citizens, as Americans, conservatives and leftists, alt-right and leftists, is they're both Americans. And then you've
And
got
they feel very
liberals and you've got
differently.
conservatives.
Yep.
They're all Americans, rural, like New Yorkers, like
Yep.
Manhattanite New Yorkers, and people from Appalachia,
And they all
Floridians,
have
and North Dakotans. We're all Americans, but
one
they're
set of
not a
neighbors.
monolith.
Yeah,
They're
one
not
set
a
of neighbors
monolith.
and another. Yeah, you're 100% right. And it's like you
And
said
that's
in the
and
very
that
beginning with like all the different ethnicities. Shoot, dude, you get different ethnic
urban and
groups.
rural. And
Uh-huh. Yep.
having been to Afghanistan and traveled across Afghanistan, I've lived in Afghan families. I've slept on their floors. Like I was not, and this is, I think, what's really important is that I never had security. I didn't travel with security. I wasn't separated from, like an embassy worker. I didn't have, I didn't go back to Kabul at night. I stayed in the provinces. I was in urban centers. I was in rural communities. I was up in the mountains of Panjshir and stayed with families in the mountains for weeks. Like I got to meet families where they were and stay with their families, literally sleeping on the floors side by side with their sons, because I was sleeping, like they were like my gatekeepers, but like it was all just a communal room. So I absolutely know that a Hazara is different than a Pashtun, is different than a Tajik, is different than Uzbek, is different than a da 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 da. And that to me is what's important is someone who's been educated in Kabul is going to be different than who's never left the mountains in Panjshir.
Yes.
And so when we and a typical and that's different and that's the same everywhere. We're not monoliths. None of us are monoliths.
But we are all human.
We are absolutely.
Yeah.
And if we were to be able to stretch up and we do this as soon as we're in an airplane. We don't have to be, up in space. As soon as we're in an airplane, we don't see those borders anymore.
Yeah.
We have arbitrarily, as it is mostly men, back in the day, who arbitrarily drew these borders. They carved up land, they drew these borders. This is, they determined who we are. I am an American with a blue passport because I was born within these borders. That then sets an identity based upon something. This is a much bigger conversation beyond my archive. We'll come back to my archive. But that starts to set different things. And at the end of the day, we're just all living on this planet and we all deserve the same basic human rights.
Yeah. Yep. And fully agreed. And I think that's all we need to, it's just like give each other the dignity that we all have been born onto this planet and have taken the, like you said, the identities that we have and are mostly trying to do our best with them.
And I do find it interesting that within the Afghan support system, particularly you saw it during the evacuation, it is really fascinating that those who are really focused on supporting Afghans in evacuation, it is a broad swath of conservatives, liberals, leftists, who are supporting Afghans.
Yep.
That's really interesting and beautiful.
I've loved it. That's been my favorite thing. It has healed my soul, honest to God, just to be part of that group of people that in my previous to the withdrawal life would not have been in my sphere, and to like be united in this endeavor it has been incredible. Let's talk about your current work, because I think it's really important and also healing in a way for women and for everybody who has seen their life change so much that you're documenting.
Thank you. I feel like this, after 3 or 4 years of just feeling grief and so much despair of the evacuations and the safeguarding and so much of that was just based in despair. The archive feels so based in hope, and it really does feel, archiving in itself is an act of resistance. It is resisting erasure. It is ensuring that history will not be forgotten and that your voice is not forgotten. So there's like that in itself just is like, okay, we are building this resistance, and within Afghan women who are spread across the diaspora, that is really empowering. We need hope right now so much. You need that feeling of rebuilding, that hope and your reserves of that there is a future to look forward to. But also that in the present moment, that there is strength and resistance when the Taliban regime is every day doing something to erase and to dehumanize and demoralize. And many of these women have family still back in Afghanistan. And so this is one way of doing something that is meaningful. And the beauty of this archive is that it has two parts. The one part is oral histories. So we're collecting the oral history of every athlete. It's starting with 16 sports, both outdoor and team sports. So basketball, football, cricket, boxing, taekwondo, judo, but also the outdoor sports like skiing, snowboarding, cycling, of course, mountain biking, BMX. But also one of the really cool sports that was quite well known in Afghanistan was the group Skatistan. So the skateboarders, because what they did was so revolutionary, and there is we have one singular swimmer, one singular break dancer. She was in the Olympics and excluded, Manija Talash. She was she was removed from the Olympics in Paris because she so bravely unfurled a cape in the Paris 2024 Olympics that said "Free Afghan Women," because obviously they were banned. So she took a stand to protest and use her stage to protest. But we have Olympians going back into judo and track, as well as more recently in Paris in cycling. So doing oral histories, and those are led by one of the very first cyclists, Tahira Shayengan, who is in the US and who studied oral history. She was actually offered a fellowship at Columbia, but amazingly, Columbia would not forego the $90,000 fee, despite her being a refugee. So she couldn't accept her fellowship. So if anybody wants to help a young, amazing refugee out with a fellowship, there's a way. But she's going to take this on as a project anyways, as soon as we have the funding. So she will collect and interview all of the athletes so that those will be done in Dari, so they have the full expression of their home language, and then we'll translate everything into English and then eventually into other languages. Then we're collecting all of the film, photo, and media assets, of which there's a lot. And I will be returning to Afghanistan in hopes of collecting a lot of the records and artifacts that were left behind. And the idea is that we digitize so that we can, so that it is available, like any archive would have much of this available for any athlete that does not want their oral history public. Of course, they can remain anonymous or not have it publicly available. But then we're also looking for a physical space, so that this would be a research center, a exhibition space, and we would have every woman's oral history, for example, would be bound, in a book, so that we'd have a full transcription bound with any photos, any other records that are relevant to her story would be bound in a book and then covered with Afghan fabric. So, traditional fabric, so that every woman's story looks like a piece of art. and then they will be presented as a giant library, with the idea that every Afghan story is worthy of a book, and that becomes its own collection within the archive. It isn't just put into files and then, filed away like a traditional archive would be. We want them to be seen and presented, and be worthy of picking up and reading.
It's incredible. I love this, and I wish you so much luck with it and getting the funding and getting those stories down. And the final words are yours, Shannon. If there's anything that I haven't asked you that you want to say, this is your floor at the moment.
Oh, thank you. I think that it's just really important right now that we remember Afghan women and that we continue to center Afghan women, that we don't let the fact that the Taliban is still in charge. And while it feels very hopeless, I think a lot of people feel like, what do? We can't, there's so little to control, is that we continue to center Afghan women. We continue to celebrate Afghan women. Rather than focus on their oppression, we focus on their achievements. They are speaking for themselves around the world, across the diaspora, in dozens of countries, and we continue to hear their voices.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you there. I want to just thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. It's so incredible and so special, and I've really enjoyed this, and I hope everybody else has too. See you again soon, and until then, Tashakor.
Tashakor. Thank you. Khorafez.